We're on our second visit to Toledo in Spain, but before we head off to the main show, which of course is the cathedral, we're just going to stop off at this little structure. It's called Cristo de la Luz because it was most recently used as a church, but it was originally a mosque, the Bab Mardum Mosque. And when it was first built around the year 1000, it was square-shaped and it was very small, and I read somewhere that it was actually, supposedly, allegedly, the smallest mosque in Europe. I don't know how true that is. The original square element is supported inside by these columns, which apparently come from an even earlier structure than the mosque, when Toledo was under the Visigoths, which explains why these capitals are in a Visigoth style. Like other religious buildings in Toledo, it was converted to a Christian church after the Reconquista. This led to the addition of a semicircular apse in a mudéjar style. We talked about mudéjar in the last video, which adapted the structure to its new use. And you actually see these semicircular apses all over town. And they're one of the things that remind you that you're in Toledo. Over each of the 9 square bays, you've got a really tall and amazing little vault. Each one is made very differently. This here is a little reflected ceiling plan of the building, and it shows how the curious little vaults directly over your head are made. It's a fabulous little structure, and it's definitely well worth a visit. The Cathedral of St. Mary is the best thing in Toledo. It's absolutely amazing. The building we see now replaces another large structure which had originally been built as a mosque, but after the Reconquista, that building was used for about 200 years for Christian worship. The assembly of structures on the site at the moment includes the cathedral proper, which was begun in 1225 in a Gothic style. But this building was changed, altered and added to in all sorts of ways, practically up until the 20th century. So it's got a very long and complicated history, as all the best buildings do. The cloister part was begun late in the 1300s, just as the cathedral was beginning to take form and finish off its roof. And because this is Toledo, it also has mudéjar elements. The development of the side chapels and chapter house, as well as the chapels which are down in the crypt, none of which can be considered minor elements in themselves because they're really quite incredible things. These are all part of the very complex story, and ideally they'd have a little video all to themselves. One of the first things that strikes you as unusual about the cathedral in Toledo is that it has a 5-bay plan. Now, this is similar to one of the great French cathedrals up north, the one at Bourges, which was finished not long before work began in Toledo, and I've read that there are connections. I actually feel that the giant side aisles make the building feel a little bit more like a mosque than a Gothic church. In fact, I think the degree to which this building can be truly called Gothic is really up for debate, but that's a video for another day. I'm just going to focus on one or two things about this building that I really love. The first is this. You stroll along the middle aisle, the inner aisle, past the beautifully sculpted choir and chancel, and you're having this Spanish Gothic-like experience with its mellow light. And then you go past the altar, which is also finely sculpted. And then you find this. This is an insertion into the original Gothic fabric of the building, and it was made in 1729. In other words, long after the cathedral was built, and it's in a Baroque style. Now, the whole assembly, if I understand correctly, is called El Transparente, and is by the artist and sculptor Narcisco Tome. Now, this little project, it involved making an opening in the roof to let light fall onto a tall piece of sculpture, which is really unbelievably elaborate, this piece here. This sculpture was so designed that early in the morning, light passes through the roof light, through an opening in the back of the reredos, and then illuminates a part of the reredos during the Mass. Now, I haven't been lucky enough to be in the cathedral when this effect is visible. I'd love to see it. And incidentally, this is the reredos where the light finally arrives. I'm calling it a reredos. It might actually technically be a retable. I'm not 100% sure. One of my other favourite parts of the building is the two-tiered choir. The main facade of the cathedral isn't quite as amazing as, let's say, Rouen or Reims. Most people think that Reims has the best Gothic facade. And in the plaza it faces out to, it competes for attention with the town hall, which I actually think is a better looking building. If John Ruskin were to critique the cathedral, I think he might say that the facade lacks power. The tower to the left was built in the 1400s and it was supposed to have a second tower, but as is often the case with these Gothic cathedrals, that didn't happen. Instead, they eventually built a Baroque dome, which was designed by the son of the painter El Greco, of whom we'll have a little bit more later. The dome sits above a small chapel, which was created so that Mass could be said in the Mozarabic rite, which isn't the same as the Roman rite. In other words, it's a different form of liturgy than the Roman rite, but it's still recognized as a Mass. The Mozarabic rite is still observed in Toledo on specific occasions during the year. And it must be a big deal because this video is broadcast on TV. Mention of El Greco's son brings us to El Greco himself. El Greco lived in the town. The connections between the painter and Toledo are so strong that there's a museum dedicated to his work on the other side of town. There are also several of his paintings in one of the rooms which forms part of the body of the cathedral. This is my least favourite thing about Toledo Cathedral. I don't really have a strong feeling for El Greco's work. But luckily for me, there are also paintings in the cathedral by Velázquez and Titian and Caravaggio and Zurbarán. It's amazing, really. The presence of these works alone would mark the cathedral out as a really important cultural location. And yet for me, these aren't the most important reasons why you would go to visit this cathedral. Personally, I don't think the cloister is quite as fabulous as the one in the monastery of San Juan de los Reyes, which we looked at in the last video, but it's still pretty cool. And it leads you to the wonderful little chapel of San Blas. I've spent the equivalent of at least a full day in Toledo Cathedral, and I still haven't had enough time to examine all the things I want to see. I find myself stopping all the time, and then I just get absorbed in some view or other, and then I forget what it was I was doing. And I've left out so much in this video, so much that really demands to be included, but hopefully this short presentation will make you want to visit the cathedral and the town. But I leave you with the monstrance. It's so intricate, it's almost overwhelming. It actually comprises 3 separate elements which are added one to the next, with the first part, which is the topmost part, made in 1500, and then the 2 other elements added a short while later. And as far as I'm aware, they still parade this amazing piece of gold and silver work through the streets of Toledo during the Corpus Christi processions.